My name is Elena Hayes, and I am a commander in the United States Navy. That sentence alone is a testament to a war fought not on the high seas, but in the silent depths of family expectation and public opinion. My father is Rear Admiral Richard Hayes, a man known to the submarine fleet as the Trident, a legend carved from Cold War steel and nuclear deterrence. He is a man of tradition, of honor, and of unbending principles. And for a decade, one of his most public principles was that women, including his own daughter, had no place on a submarine. The story of how I ended up giving my own father, the admiral who publicly denounced my career, his final tour on my submarine, that's a story about a debt that could only be paid in the crushing pressure of the deep, a story of a silence that was finally broken. What would you do if the person you admired most in the world became the biggest obstacle to your dreams? Before I dive into this story, a story that took me 20 years to live and even longer to understand, I'd love to know where all of you are watching from today. Let me know in the comments below, and if you've ever had to fight to prove yourself to someone you love, go ahead and hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe because this is a community for people who understand that sometimes the quietest battles are the hardest to win. The Hayes family name carried a certain weight in the naval town of Norfolk, Virginia. It smelled of salt, diesel, and old leather-bound books on maritime strategy. Our house was a museum of my father's career. On the mantel sat a brass-plated clock from a decommissioned ship, its ticking a constant, steady heartbeat. The walls were a gallery of his triumphs, a photo of him shaking a president's hand, another of him on the sail of his first command, the USS Los Angeles, a grim, proud smile on his young face. To me, he was not just my father, he was a titan, a hero pulled from the pages of a Tom Clancy novel. He was the man who controlled a billion-dollar warship that moved like a ghost beneath the waves, a silent protector of the nation. I didn't just love him, I worshipped him. Some of my earliest memories are of him returning from a patrol. The house would be filled with a nervous, electric energy for days beforehand. My mother, Caroline, would bake his favorite lemon pound cake, its sweet scent a welcome flag for his arrival. I would sit on the front steps, my small hands clutching a crayon drawing of a submarine, a lopsided gray behemoth with a smiling stick figure waving from the top. When his car finally pulled into the driveway, I would sprint across the lawn and leap into his arms. He smelled of recycled air, machine oil, and the faint, clean scent of the sea. He would lift me up, his large, calloused hands gentle, and his laughter would fill the quiet street. "There's my little sailor," he'd rumble, his voice a low, comforting vibration. "Did you keep the home seas safe for me?" He was a different man on shore. The iron-willed commander of the deep would melt away, replaced by a father who taught me how to tie a bowline knot until my fingers were sore, who spent hours on our small sailboat, the Caroline Star, showing me how the constellations could guide us home. He'd point a thick finger at the night sky. "Look there, Ellie," he'd say, his voice full of reverence. "That's Polaris, the North Star. It doesn't move. No matter how lost you feel, no matter how much the world spins, you can always find your way if you keep your eye on something true." I took his words to heart. He was my North Star. His approval was the only bearing I ever cared to take. I devoured every book he owned on naval history. I built plastic models of submarines, my fingers sticky with glue, meticulously painting the tiny hulls the same shade of flat black as the photos on his wall. He encouraged it, of course. He saw it as a daughter's natural admiration for her father's world. I think in his mind, he imagined me marrying a fine young naval officer, becoming the rock-solid wife who kept the home fires burning, just as my mother had. He saw me as part of the support structure, the essential but unseen foundation upon which the real warriors stood. He never imagined that I wanted to stand on that structure myself. My mother was the gentle sea that bridged the gap between my father's granite shore and my own rising tide. She understood us both in a way we couldn't understand each other. She saw the same stubbornness, the same passion for the sea, reflected in our eyes. I remember one evening, I was about 12, wrestling with a particularly difficult physics problem. My father glanced at my textbook, a small dismissive smile playing on his lips. That's heavy stuff for a young lady, Ellie. Don't you have some novel you'd rather be reading? Before I could even feel the sting, my mother's voice, calm and even, came from the kitchen. Richard, her mind is a vessel just like your submarines. It's built to explore the deep. Don't you dare tell her where she can or cannot sail. My father looked surprised, then he chuckled and ruffled my hair. All right, all right. Point taken, Caroline, but the seed was there. His world had clearly defined roles, and mine were already starting to blur the lines he held so dear. My mother nurtured my curiosity. She bought me a telescope for my 13th birthday, and we'd spend hours on the back porch charting stars, her voice a soft counterpoint to my father's booming lessons on navigation. She was teaching me the same lesson, but with a different purpose. He taught me to find my way home. She taught me that I could choose my own destination. The world shifted on its axis when I was a senior in high school, preparing my application for the Naval Academy at Annapolis. It was a foregone conclusion in my mind, the only path I had ever considered. That was the year the Secretary of the Navy announced the policy change. Women would now be eligible to serve in the submarine force. I remember the news report vividly. I was in the living room, supposedly finishing a history paper, but the television was on, a newscaster was speaking, and the chyron at the bottom of the screen read, Navy opens submarines to women. My heart hammered against my ribs. It wasn't just a policy change, it was a door swinging open into a world I had only ever been allowed to view from the shore, the silent service, the deep. My father's world. It was suddenly, impossibly, within my reach. I felt a sense of destiny so powerful, it was like a physical force, a current pulling me toward an unseen shore. I knew with the kind of bone-deep certainty that defies logic that this was my path. I waited for the right moment to tell him. It was a Saturday. He was in his study, a room that was his sanctuary, filled with the smell of old paper and pipe tobacco. He was cleaning his ceremonial sword, a ritual he performed with meditative focus. The sunlight streamed through the window, glinting off the polished steel. I stood in the doorway, my hands clammy, my carefully rehearsed speech dissolving in my throat. Dad, I said, my voice barely a whisper. He looked up, his expression open and relaxed. What is it, Ellie Bean? I took a deep breath. I've made a decision about my service selection at the academy. I want to go into submarines. The change was instantaneous and terrifying. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, hard glare I had only ever seen in the official photographs on the wall. The sword lay still in his hands. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with a sudden oppressive pressure. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His words were quiet, precise, and they cut me deeper than any shout could have. No, he said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. Absolutely not. I tried to argue, to explain. But Dad, the policy changed. I'm qualified. My grades in physics, in math. He held up a hand, silencing me. This has nothing to do with your grades, he said, his voice laced with a condescending disappointment that made me feel small, foolish. The submarine service is not a social experiment, Elena. It is the lethal end of American foreign policy. It is a closed, violent, intensely demanding environment. It is not a place for distractions. Distractions. The word hung in the air between us, ugly and sharp. He didn't see me, his daughter. He saw a problem, a complication, a threat to the sanctity of his world. I wouldn't be a distraction, I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of hurt and defiance. I would be an officer, just like you. He stood up then, placing the sword carefully back on its velvet rests. He looked at me, and for the first time I felt like he wasn't seeing his child, but an adversary. You don't understand what you're asking, he said, his tone final. You would be compromising the effectiveness of a warship. You'd be putting men's lives at risk for the sake of your own ambition. He saw my ambition as a selfish thing, a frivolous desire that threatened the serious business of men. It was a fundamental misreading of who I was. My ambition wasn't for myself. It was to be like him, and he was throwing it back in my face as an insult. The conversation was over. He walked past me out of the study, leaving me standing alone in the sudden chill of the room, the glinting sword a silent witness to the first major fracture in our relationship. The man who had taught me to navigate by the stars had just told me my chosen destination was off limits. The true betrayal, the one that would echo through the next decade of my life, came a few weeks later. I was at the academy, a plebe struggling through my first year. The news of my chosen career path had already made me something of a curiosity. I was Admiral Hayes's daughter, the one who was going to try for subs. There were whispers, skeptical looks from upperclassmen, even a few condescending remarks from instructors who were my father's contemporaries. I was bracing for it. I thought I was ready. I was not. One evening, the entire common room of my residence hall went quiet. Everyone was staring at the large television mounted on the wall. A major news network was running a special segment, A Sea Change: Women in Combat. And there, sitting in a leather chair opposite a well-known journalist, was my father, Rear Admiral Richard Hayes, in his full-dress whites, a constellation of ribbons on his chest. He looked powerful, authoritative, the very image of naval command. The journalist turned to him. "Admiral, you've spent 30 years in the silent service. You've commanded a fast attack and a boomer. You are one of the most respected voices in the submarine community. What are your thoughts on this new policy to integrate women onto submarines?" I stood frozen, a textbook slipping from my grasp and hitting the floor with a dull thud. I could feel every eye in the room on me. My father leaned forward, his expression grave, his voice resonating with that unshakable conviction I had once admired so much. "It's a mistake," he said without a moment's hesitation, "a profound and dangerous mistake." He went on, his words a clinical, brutal dissection of my dream. He spoke of eroding a warrior ethos, of the unique strains of long-duration submerged patrols and the inevitable disruption to unit cohesion. He painted a picture of a submarine crew as a fragile, delicate brotherhood that the mere presence of a woman would shatter. "We are asking our submariners to do the impossible every single day," he declared, his gaze fixed on the camera. "We cannot, in good conscience, add a complex social experiment to that burden. It compromises the mission. It compromises combat effectiveness. And that is a price I am not willing to pay." He never used my name. He didn't have to. Every midshipman in that room, every officer on that base, knew exactly who he was talking about. He was talking about me. He was using his legendary status, his immense credibility, to publicly, nationally, decimate my ambition. He was telling the entire world that his own daughter was a liability. The silence in the common room was deafening. It was thick with pity and a kind of morbid curiosity. No one looked at me directly, but I could feel their gazes like a physical weight. I turned and walked out, my back straight, my face a stony mask. I didn't run. I didn't cry. I walked to my room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of my perfectly made bed. The sterile, impersonal room felt like a prison cell. I picked up the phone and called him. He answered on the second ring. "I saw you," I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. "On the news." There was a pause. "Elena," he began, and for a fleeting moment I heard a flicker of something other than iron in his voice. Maybe regret, maybe hesitation. But it was gone as quickly as it came. I stood by my convictions. I said what I believed to be true. "This is about the integrity of the service. It is bigger than you. It is bigger than me. Bigger than me." He had taken our deeply personal conflict and turned it into a public policy debate, sacrificing me on the altar of his principles. That was the moment my hero worship died. It curdled into something cold and hard in my chest. "I see," I said. "Well, Admiral, you should know. I've already submitted my preference. I will be joining the submarine service, and I will succeed, not to prove you wrong, but to prove me right." I hung up the phone before he could reply. The North Star I had navigated by my entire life had just vanished from the sky. I was adrift on a dark, unfamiliar sea, with only a cold, burning anger to light my way. That anger would have to be enough. My mother's death a year later was the final severing blow. She had been the last bridge, the final piece of common ground. Her cancer was swift and merciless. At the funeral, my father and I stood on opposite sides of the grave, two strangers bound by a shared unspeakable grief. We didn't speak of my career. We didn't speak of the interview. We barely spoke at all. The silence that had begun in his study had now become a vast frozen expanse, and with my mother gone, there was no one left who knew how to thaw it. I was truly on my own. The United States Navy's Nuclear Power School in Charleston, South Carolina, is designed to do two things: forge the most technically proficient nuclear operators in the world, and break those who are not up to the task. It is a crucible of academic pressure, a relentless fire hose of physics, chemistry, reactor dynamics, and thermodynamics. For me, it was also a trial by fire in a different sense. I was one of only a handful of women in my class, a conspicuous presence in a sea of young men. My father's infamous interview hung over me like a shroud. I was not just Midshipman Hayes. I was the Admiral's daughter, the walking embodiment of the social experiment he had so publicly condemned. The skepticism was palpable. It wasn't overt hostility, not usually. It was more insidious. It was the way conversations would stop when I entered a room. It was being consistently overlooked for study groups. It was the condescending tone of an instructor who would over-explain a simple concept to me, assuming I couldn't grasp it, while treating my male counterparts as peers. Every day was a test. Every exam, every graded evolution in the simulator was not just about passing. It was about proving I belonged. I buried myself in my books. Sleep became a luxury. I lived on caffeine and a stubborn refusal to fail. I filled notebooks with reactor diagrams, memorized casualty procedures until they were muscle memory, and spent my nights under the fluorescent hum of the library, determined to know more, to be better, to be unassailable. There was one incident that crystallized the entire experience. We were in the final phase of training, working on a hands-on prototype reactor. My partner for the evolution was a young officer, Lieutenant Junior Grade Simmons, a cocky, affable guy who had made it clear he believed in my father's assessment of things. We were simulating a loss of coolant accident, one of the most serious casualties you can face. Alarms blared, red lights flashed, and the instructor, a grizzled senior chief with a face like a topographical map, barked orders and observations. Simmons froze. It was only for a second, but in a reactor casualty, a second is an eternity. He stared at the gauges, his mind blanking under the pressure. I didn't hesitate. I bypassed his station, my hands flying across the control panel, isolating the leak, initiating emergency cooling, my voice calm and steady as I called out the procedural steps, just as I had practiced 1,000 times in my head. Reactor scrammed, emergency diesel generators online, initiating emergency boration. Within 30 seconds, I had the plant in a stable, safe condition. The alarms went silent. The flashing lights ceased. In the ringing silence, the senior chief looked from the stable board to a pale and sweating Simmons, and then to me. He just nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. He didn't say a word, but later that day, as I was packing my gear, he walked by. "Hayes," he said, not breaking stride. "Nice work in there today. You've got good instincts. You keep your head." It was a small thing, a few tossed-off words, but in that environment it was a lifeline. It was the first time someone in that world had judged me solely on my actions, not my gender or my last name. It was the first brick in the foundation of my own self-respect. After the grueling academic gauntlet, I was assigned to my first boat, the USS Virginia, as a junior officer. Life aboard a submarine is a study in controlled claustrophobia. You live and work in a 377-foot steel tube with over 100 other people, surrounded by the constant hum of machinery, the smell of filtered air, and the ever-present crushing weight of the ocean above you. The scrutiny I faced in nuclear power school was nothing compared to this. Here I was a 24-hour-a-day curiosity. Every move I made, every word I spoke, was observed, analyzed, and judged. I was the first woman many of these sailors had ever served with, and I was a daily test of my father's dire predictions. The resistance was subtle but constant. It was the pioneer tax, a term we early women used. It was the assumption that I couldn't carry a heavy toolkit, the way my technical suggestions were initially ignored in favor of a male colleague's, only for his idea to be the exact same as mine. It was the loneliness. While the men would bond over crude jokes and shared stories in the mess, I was an outsider, perpetually maintaining a professional distance that was often mistaken for coldness. It was during this tour that I met Master Chief Petty Officer Frank Miller. He was the chief of the boat, the senior enlisted man on board, and a legend in his own right. He had served with my father back in the 80s on the old Sturgeon-class boats. He was quiet, watchful, with eyes that seemed to see everything. For the first few months, he barely spoke to me, just observed. I was certain he shared my father's views. Then one day, we were conducting a maintenance procedure on a seawater pump in the engine room. It was a filthy, difficult job in a cramped, sweltering space. One of the younger sailors, a machinist's mate third class, was struggling with a frozen bolt. He was getting frustrated. His knuckles were bleeding. Another petty officer sneered. "What's the matter, son? Can't handle it. Maybe we should ask Miss Hayes to give you a hand. She's probably used to dealing with delicate things." The comment was met with a few snickers. I felt a hot flush of anger and humiliation. Before I could say anything, Master Chief Miller's voice cut through the noise, low and dangerous. "That's enough, Petty Officer Stevens." He turned to the young sailor. "Give me the wrench." He positioned himself, applied precise leverage, and with a grunt the bolt broke free. Then he looked directly at Stevens. "Lieutenant Hayes is a qualified nuclear engineer. She probably knows more about the metallurgy of that bolt than anyone in this engine room. The next person who makes a comment about anything other than her ability to do her job will be having a very long, very unpleasant conversation with me in my office. Do we understand each other?" A chorus of "Yes, Master Chief," echoed through the space. He then turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, you have the watch. Carry on." Later that week he found me in the ship's tiny library, reviewing schematics. He pulled up a chair. "Your father is a great man," he began, his voice quiet. "One of the best submariners I ever knew. He's also a stubborn old mule who is scared of change." I was taken aback by his directness. "He thinks I'm a threat to everything he built," I said, the words tasting like ash. Master Chief Miller shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am, that's not it. He's not scared you're going to fail. He's scared you're going to succeed. He's scared you're going to get hurt. And he's scared that the Navy he loves is changing into something he doesn't recognize. Fear makes good men do foolish things." He said what he said on TV, and now his pride won't let him walk it back. He leaned in a little closer. "Don't spend your career trying to get his approval. You'll never get it that way. Spend your career earning the respect of your sailors. You do that, and the rest will take care of itself. The best way to prove him wrong is to be so damn good he can't ignore it." His words were a revelation. He was giving me a new chart, a new set of bearings. He was telling me to stop navigating by my father's dead star and to start navigating by my own. From that day on, he became my silent ally, my mentor. A nod of approval after a well-executed drill, a quiet word of technical advice, a story about my father that revealed the man behind the admiral's uniform. He helped me understand my father's flaws without excusing them. Years passed. The deep became my home. I moved from the Virginia to my department head tour on the USS New Hampshire. I served as engineering officer, a job that tested every ounce of my knowledge and leadership. I learned to live and breathe the rhythm of the boat, the endless cycle of watch, sleep, and work. I learned the names of my sailors' children, the stories of their hometowns. I earned their trust, not with speeches, but by being there with them in the bilges, by knowing my systems better than anyone, and by making the right call under pressure. I remember one Christmas, we were on patrol somewhere under the Arctic ice cap. It was my 4th holiday season spent away from home. I saw a junior sailor looking at a picture of his family, his face a mask of sadness. I remembered the Christmases of my childhood, the warmth of the fireplace, the smell of pine. I knew my father was likely at some grand family gathering, surrounded by relatives who probably toasted his name while I was 1,000 feet beneath the ice, a forgotten footnote in his life. The loneliness was a physical ache, but then I looked around the mess deck. I saw my sailors, my crew, sharing stories, playing cards, creating a family in the belly of a steel whale. I was their leader. I was responsible for them. This was my family now. The thought didn't erase the sadness, but it gave it a new context. I was no longer just adrift. I was a captain of my own small, resilient world. My contact with my father remained sparse and formal. I sent him an email when I was promoted to lieutenant commander. His reply was a single typed line, "Well done, Richard. No dad, no love." Just his name, like a signature on an official document. He never asked about my work, my ship, my life. Our phone calls were brief, stilted affairs, filled with long, awkward silences. We'd talk about the weather in Norfolk, his golf game, the health of distant relatives. We talked about everything except the one thing that defined my entire existence. It was a silent, undeclared truce. He would not acknowledge my world, and I would not force it upon him. It was a constant low-grade pain, a wound that never fully healed. I had proven the skeptics wrong. I had earned the respect of my peers and my crews. I had built a successful career against the odds. But the one man whose respect I had craved since childhood remained a locked door. I told myself it didn't matter. I repeated Master Chief Miller's advice to myself like a mantra. But in the quiet hours of a mid-watch, alone in the dim glow of the control room, the truth was harder to ignore. I still wanted my dad to be proud of me. Then came the letter. A thick, official envelope from the Department of the Navy. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. "The Board for Submarine Command has met," it began. My eyes scanned the page, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. And then I saw it. My name. Commander Elena Hayes has been selected for command of the Pre-Commissioning Unit Montana, SSN 794. Command. The pinnacle of a line officer's career, captain of my own boat. Not just any boat, but the newest, most advanced Virginia-class submarine in the fleet. A wave of elation so pure and powerful washed over me, chasing away years of doubt and loneliness. I had done it. I had reached the summit. After the initial euphoria faded, a familiar sadness settled in. I thought of my father. This was the achievement he would understand, the one that mirrored his own career. I owed him the news, as a matter of protocol, if not affection. I sat down and composed a short formal email, just as I had for my last promotion. "Sir," I wrote, foregoing any familial address. "For your information, I have been selected for command of the future USS Montana." I hit send, my stomach in knots, expecting the usual terse reply. His response came within the hour. It was one sentence. "Congratulations. Don't sink it." The words were a gut punch. It was meant as a joke, I suppose, the kind of dry gallows humor common among submariners. But coming from him after years of silent disapproval, it was just cruel. It was a final, dismissive pat on the head, a reminder that even at the peak of my profession, he still saw me as the little girl playing with things she didn't understand. I closed the laptop, the anger from that day in his study, flaring back to life, hot and clean. Fine. If that's how he wanted it, fine. I would not just command the Montana, I would make it the finest boat in the United States Navy. And I would do it without him. The next 2 years were a whirlwind of activity. I oversaw the final stages of the Montana's construction at the shipyard in Groton, Connecticut. I handpicked my crew, my department heads, my chief of the boat, a man who, like Master Chief Miller, believed in judging people by their performance, not their preconceptions. We took the boat through its initial sea trials, a series of grueling tests to push every system to its limit. We commissioned her in a proud ceremony, my crew standing sharp and professional on the deck, my command pin glinting on my chest. I felt a sense of ownership, of profound connection to the ship and the 130 souls aboard her. She was not just a vessel of war, she was a living thing, and I was her heart. We became an operational frontline unit, and by all accounts, we were good. More than good, we were exceptional. We excelled in every exercise, earned every qualification, and set a new standard for operational readiness. My father never visited, he never called to ask about the ship. The silence from Norfolk was as deep and vast as the ocean itself. Then the news broke. It rippled through the submarine community first, then hit the major news outlets. Rear Admiral Richard, the Trident. Hayes was retiring. After 40 years of distinguished service, the legend was hanging up his uniform. The Navy, ever mindful of its history and its heroes, decided to give him a send-off for the ages. The Chief of Naval Operations himself, a progressive admiral who had championed my career from a distance, called me personally. "Elena," he said, his voice warm but with an undercurrent of official business. "We're putting together a retirement ceremony for your father. The PR folks have an idea. They want to give him one last ride, a symbolic final patrol on the newest, most advanced boat in the fleet." I held my breath. I knew what was coming. "That would be you," he confirmed. "The USS Montana. I think it's appropriate." I could hear the unspoken meaning in his voice. This wasn't just a PR stunt. It was a reckoning. "Does he know?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Does he know I'm the captain?" The CNO chuckled. "All he knows is the hull number. I thought it would be better as a surprise." "Is that a problem, Commander?" I thought of his last email. Don't sink it. I thought of his face on that television screen all those years ago. "No, sir," I said, my voice suddenly firm, clear as a bell. "That's not a problem at all. We would be honored to have the Admiral aboard." The day of his arrival was gray and overcast, the sky over Groton the color of lead. A stiff wind whipped off the Thames River, snapping the flags on the pier. The media was there, of course, a small army of cameras and reporters, huddled against the cold, ready to capture the final voyage of a naval icon. I watched from the sail of the Montana, a silent observer high above the commotion. I saw his car arrive, a sleek black sedan provided by the Navy. He stepped out, looking every bit the legend. He was in his dress whites, the uniform immaculate, the gold braid on his hat gleaming even in the dull light. He looked older than I remembered, the lines on his face carved a little deeper, his shoulders not quite as broad. But the aura of command was still there, an almost visible field of energy around him. He shook hands with the base commander, smiled for the cameras, and then he turned his attention to my boat. He looked up at the black, immense hull of the Montana, a vessel of power and lethality that would have been science fiction when he was a young officer. I could see the pride, the nostalgia, the deep, abiding love for the service in his eyes. He was coming home one last time. I descended into the hull before he came aboard. I wanted the reveal to happen in my element, in the heart of my command. I stood in the control room, the nerve center of the ship. The atmosphere was electric, but not with nerves. My crew was calm, professional, ready. They knew the history. They all did. My XO, Lieutenant Commander David Chen, a brilliant officer I would trust with my life, gave me a small, reassuring nod. "All stations manned and ready, Captain. The Admiral is on the pier." "Very well, XO," I said, my voice even. "Greet him at the brow and escort him to control." The minutes stretched out, each one feeling like an hour. I could hear the sounds from topside, the formal greetings, the footsteps on the gangway. I kept my back to the entrance, my eyes fixed on the tactical plot display. I heard footsteps descending the ladder into the control room. I heard my XO's voice. "Admiral, welcome aboard the USS Montana." I heard my father's familiar, rumbling reply. "Thank you, Commander. A magnificent boat. Where's the captain? I'd like to pay my respects before we get underway." The moment had arrived. The air in the control room seemed to crackle. My entire crew was silent, watching, waiting. I took a slow, steadying breath, the recycled air of my ship filling my lungs. Then I turned from the display. He was standing not 10 feet from me. His eyes were scanning the room, taking in the state-of-the-art displays, the quiet efficiency of the watchstanders. He was looking for a man, a peer, some hotshot commander he had probably mentored years ago. His gaze swept past me once, not registering, then it snapped back. Our eyes met across the dim, blue-lit space. I saw the sequence of emotions play across his face in a breathtaking, slow-motion cascade. First, simple recognition, then profound, uncomprehending confusion. His brow furrowed, his mouth opened slightly, as if to form a question he couldn't articulate. The legendary composure of the Trident shattered into a million pieces. The reporters, the ceremony, the Navy's grand plan, it all evaporated, leaving only this one, impossible moment in the belly of a warship. The whir of the ventilation and the soft hum of the electronics were the only sounds in the world. He stared at me as if I were a ghost. I let the silence hang for a beat, letting the reality of the situation settle into the marrow of his bones. Then I broke it. My voice was quiet, but it carried through the entire control room, firm and steady. "Dad?" I said, the word slipping out before I could stop it. I saw him flinch, a barely perceptible tremor. I corrected myself immediately. My training, my professionalism, taking over. I stood a little taller, my shoulders back. "Admiral Hayes," I said, my tone now formal, respectful, and utterly in command. "Welcome aboard the USS Montana. I'm Commander Hayes, and I have the con." For a long moment, my father said nothing. He simply stood there, rooted to the deck, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. The carefully constructed world of Richard Hayes, a world of tradition and unyielding order, had just been turned completely upside down. He looked from me to my command pin, then to the attentive faces of my crew, and back to me. It was as if he was trying to solve an impossible equation in his head. The XO, David Chen, ever the professional, stepped smoothly into the breach. "Admiral, if you'll follow me, we can get you settled in before we make our departure." The words seemed to break the spell. My father gave a short, jerky nod, his eyes still locked on mine. He looked utterly lost. As the XO led him out of the control room toward the small stateroom reserved for guests, I turned back to my watch team. "Let's get underway, people," I said, my voice betraying none of the turmoil churning inside me. "Maneuvering. Make your preparations to get underway. Helm, sonar, con, report when ready." The familiar, practiced rhythm of the pre-underway checklist took over, a comforting liturgy in the wake of the emotional tempest that had just passed through. But even as I gave the orders to cast off lines and slip beneath the waves, a part of my mind was with my father, alone in that small cabin, grappling with the fact that the social experiment he had so vehemently opposed was now his captain. An hour later, we were deep in the Atlantic, moving with the ghostly silence that is the hallmark of a nuclear submarine. The XO informed me that the Admiral was ready for his tour. I met him in the narrow passageway outside his stateroom. He had changed from his dress whites into a simple khaki jumpsuit provided by the ship, the kind worn by officers. The change was symbolic. It stripped away the pomp and circumstance, leaving just a man. He looked subdued, his earlier shock replaced by a quiet, watchful intensity. "Admiral," I said, my tone strictly professional, "if you're ready, I'll show you the ship." He nodded, his gaze sweeping over the polished deck plates and the bundles of cables overhead. "She's quiet," he observed. It was the highest compliment a submariner could give. "Quietest boat in the fleet, sir," I replied with a touch of pride. I started the tour, leading him through the labyrinthine corridors of the Montana. I wasn't gloating. I wasn't trying to rub his face in my success. I was simply a captain showing off her ship. This was my world, and I was fluent in its language. I took him to the sonar room, where our traditional periscopes had been replaced by a state-of-the-art photonics mast, its high-definition imagery displayed on large screens. He stared at the crystal-clear picture of the ocean surface, a world away. "No periscope," he murmured, more to himself than to me. I spent half my life with my eye glued to a scope. I pointed to a young woman, a petty officer second class, her fingers flying across a sonar console, her face a mask of intense concentration as she classified the distant sound of a merchant vessel. "Sonar supervisor, report all contacts." "Con, sonar," she replied crisply, not taking her eyes off the waterfall display. "Have contact Sierra 1, classified as a merchant tanker, bearing 310. No other contacts of interest at this time." My father watched her, his expression unreadable. He was seeing it. He was seeing the reality that dismantled every one of his old arguments. Here was a woman, expertly managing the ears of a warship, a critical role, and the world was not ending. The ship was not compromised. She was just a sailor, and a damned good one. He didn't say anything, but I saw the subtle shift in his posture, the slight relaxing of his rigid shoulders. We moved on to the torpedo room. The massive polished weapons were nestled in their racks, a silent promise of immense power. The torpedo man in charge, a burly chief petty officer with a thick mustache, gave the Admiral a crisp briefing on the capabilities of the new Mark 48 ACAP torpedoes. My father listened intently, asking sharp technical questions. He wasn't testing the chief. He was genuinely curious. He was a student again, learning a new generation of technology. He saw the easy, respectful way the chief interacted with me, providing information, awaiting my command. He saw a crew that was integrated, professional, and loyal, not to me as a woman, but to me as their captain. The culmination of the tour was our meal in the wardroom, the officers' dining space. We sat at the small table, my father, myself, the XO, and my engineering officer. The conversation was stilted at first, the junior officers clearly intimidated by the living legend in their midst. My father, to his credit, tried to put them at ease, asking about their hometowns, their alma maters. Then he turned to me, his eyes locking on mine across the table. He was ready to test me. "Commander," he said, his voice carrying the old weight of command. "The Russians have been making significant strides with their Yasen M class. Their acoustic signature is a fraction of what their older boats were. What's your professional assessment of the Montana's tactical advantage against that specific threat?" The table went silent. The XO looked at me, a flicker of concern in his eyes. It was a hardball question, a direct challenge to my tactical acumen, the kind of question a flag officer asks a commanding officer to see if they truly know their business. I didn't flinch. I met his gaze, took a sip of water, and began. I laid out the classified data on our own ship's quieting, the advanced processing of our sonar arrays, and the unique tactical employment of our towed arrays. I discussed the limitations of the Yasen M's propulsion system at certain speeds and the thermal layers in the North Atlantic that we could use to our advantage. I wasn't just reciting from a manual, I was synthesizing years of operational experience, intelligence briefs, and my own deep understanding of undersea warfare. I was speaking as a master of my craft. When I finished, there was a beat of silence. My father just stared at me, the last vestiges of skepticism in his eyes dissolving. He gave a single, slow nod. It wasn't a concession, it was an acknowledgement. He had looked for a weakness, a flaw in the social experiment, and had found none. He had found only a competent, confident, and knowledgeable submarine commander. He had found his daughter. Later, after the meal, I was in my stateroom, reviewing the ship's log. The cabin was a small, Spartan space, the only personal touch a small framed photograph on my desk. It was a picture of my mother, taken on their sailboat, the wind in her hair, a radiant smile on her face. There was a soft knock on the door. It was my father. "May I have a word, Captain?" he asked, his voice quiet, formal. "Of course, Admiral," I replied, gesturing to the small chair opposite my desk. He entered and sat down, the small space suddenly feeling crowded with the weight of unspoken history. He didn't speak for a long time. He just looked around the cabin, at the charts on the wall, the tactical manuals on the shelf. His eyes came to rest on the photograph on my desk. "Caroline," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I hadn't heard from him in years. "She always believed in you, without question." He finally looked at me, and the Admiral was gone. All I saw was my dad, an old man looking tired and full of regret. "I was wrong, Ellie," he said, the words sounding rusty, as if they hadn't been used in decades. I was so wrong. He wasn't looking for forgiveness. He was just stating a fact he had finally been forced to confront. "I wasn't wrong about the service I knew," he continued, fumbling for the right words. "It was a hard, rough life. I thought I was protecting you from it, but I was wrong about the service it could become. The service that people like you, have built. I said those things on television because I was afraid. Afraid for you, yes, but mostly I was afraid of change. I was afraid my world was disappearing. It's no excuse. It was pride, a foolish, stubborn pride." He reached into the pocket of his jumpsuit and pulled out a small, worn object. It was a gold pin, the two dolphins of the submarine warfare insignia. It was his own command pin, the one he had worn with such pride for years. He placed it gently on the desk, next to the picture of my mother. "This is yours," he said, his voice cracking. "You earned this. You earned it in a way I never had to." The next morning we surfaced. The sky was clear, the sun brilliant on the blue, rolling waves of the Atlantic. The crew, in their dress blues, was mustered on the deck, lining the rails as a sign of respect. My father, back in his immaculate whites, stood at the gangway, ready to depart. A helicopter was waiting on a nearby support ship to take him ashore. He turned at the top of the brow, looking back at the Montana. I was on the sail, in my traditional spot for arrivals and departures, a commanding figure against the bright sky. He looked up at me, and our eyes met one last time. He didn't wave, he didn't smile. He brought his right hand up in a slow, perfect, trembling salute. It was not the crisp salute of an admiral to a commander. It was the salute of a father to his daughter, an act of surrender, of apology, of profound, heartbreaking pride. I felt the tears that I had held back for 20 years well up in my eyes, blurring the image of him. My own hand came up, returning the salute, my form as sharp and steady as I could make it. In that silent, shared gesture, a war that had lasted half my life was finally over. The North Star had returned to my sky. My father's validation was something I had craved for years. It was a hole in my life that I had tried to fill with promotions, with qualifications, with the respect of my crew. But standing on that sail, watching him salute me, I realized something profound. His approval, when it finally came, was welcome. It was healing, but it wasn't necessary. The respect I had truly been fighting for, the validation I had desperately needed, was my own. I had earned it in the fire of nuclear power school, in the lonely mid-watches under the ice, in the trust of my sailors, and in the quiet confidence of a command well run. My father hadn't given me my worth. He had just finally opened his eyes and seen the worth that I had built for myself, piece by painful piece. His journey was to overcome his pride. Mine was to overcome the need for his approval. We met finally on the deck of my ship, as equals. Legacy, I've learned, isn't something that's handed down to you like a family heirloom. It isn't about protecting the past from the future. True legacy is what you build yourself, often from the rubble of other people's expectations. It's about having the courage to navigate by your own stars, even when the most important person in your world tells you you're sailing into the dark. In the end, I didn't just prove my father wrong. I showed him a new way forward. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of all. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it gives you strength in whatever battles you may be fighting. What did you think of my father's final gesture? Was it enough? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever been underestimated by someone you love, only to prove them wrong in the most undeniable way? Please share your story. This is a place where those stories are honored. Don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you, and subscribe for more stories about overcoming the odds. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Be strong and navigate your own course.